Welcome to Phoenix Masonry Live.
A show about Masonic museum artifacts,
Interviews,
Masonic history,
and much more.
I am Frederick L. Milliken, Executive Director of Phoenix Masonry.
And I am Elena Llamas, Director of Public Relations for Phoenix Masonry.
And we are here to
celebrate
our Freemasonry!
Celebrando nuestra francmasonería.
And that's what we do here. We celebrate Freemasonry. And today we're celebrating with renowned author and researcher Tehuti Evans. Welcome, Tehuti, to the show.
Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation.
Alonzo Tehuti Evans majored in engineering. Baba Tehuti joined the ranks of the African Rebellion against racial hatred in 1961 when he began protesting Jim Crow laws in America as part of the Temporary Student Coordinating Committee, predecessor to SNCC, while at Howard University.
He left Howard and enlisted in the U.S. Air Force, where he served as a military engineer for almost 12 years, from 1964 to 75. Experience enabled him to travel to North and West Africa, France, Germany, and Amsterdam in Europe, South Korea, Vietnam, Taiwan, Guam, the Northern Marianas in Asia, and several bases in the continental United States. He is a decorated veteran of the Vietnam War.
After resigning from the Air Force in 1975, Brother Evans enrolled at Federal City College in Washington, D.C. to study history under the tutelage of Dr. C.L.R. James. In 1978, he graduated from the University of the District of Columbia with degrees in history and philosophy. He enrolled in Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts to pursue his doctoral.
Tehuti Evans's post-military professional career began with the National Urban League in 1976. Upon graduating from UDC in 1978, he began working for the Washington Urban League as a senior job developer, where he applied the focus of his doctoral studies using history as a motivational tool to educate ethnic minorities in job training and community education programs.
In 1983, he was named the Washington Urban League's Man of the Year and promoted to Director of Employment and Training.
In 1984, he joined International Telephone and Telegraph Corporation, ITT, in Washington, D.C., and in 1986, he became an educational consultant with KJ Associates of Silver Springs, Maryland.
Brother Evans was a founding member of the University of the District of Columbia Alumni Association in 1978, where he served as its chairman of the board of directors, 1979, 1986, and as a member of the Board of Trustees of the University of the District of Columbia from 1988 through 1992.
In 1977, he joined the faculty of the Washington Saturday College at Howard University, teaching undergraduate courses in history and philosophy. And in 1999, he was made the Dean of the WSC School of Behavior and Social Sciences.
In 1995, Brother Tehuti Evans was a co-founder of and the resident scholar at the House of Commit Bookstore and Cultural Shop, which is located on historic Georgia Avenue in Washington, D.C., near Howard University.
He has lectured as main presenter for the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilization, ASCAC, as well as several American universities such as the University of Massachusetts, University of Maryland, Wayne State University, the University of Chicago, Morgan State University, Temple University, and Howard University. Among his current interests, serving as the resident agent and member of the board of directors for the Mignon L.I. Ford Foundation is his most satisfying. The foundation is an Ethiopian-American organization committed to continuing the legacy of a great family which migrated to Ethiopia in the 1920s and established the first co-educational school for Ethiopian children.
Brother Evans joined Redemption Lodge number 24 in November 2010. After volunteering with Brother Roundtree for 6 months, he was raised at a site in a Grand Lodge, Occasional Lodge, by Most Worshipful Grand Master David A. McWilliams on November 13th, 2010. He has served as Worshipful Master 2013 through 2015 and Secretary 2015 through the present of the David A. McWilliams Senior Research and Educational Lodge of the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Washington, D.C., and President of the Charles W. Sharp Senior Philaxis Chapter 2013 through 2017, and Secretary and KSNA of the Jonathan Davis Consistory number 1 from 2016 to the present. And Brother Evans also served as the Worshipful Grand Editor of the Masonic Digest newspaper of the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Washington, D.C., 2015 through 2016.
Tehuti Evans is a life member of the PHA Philaxis Society. He was named in March 2017, we'll get to this in a minute, a Fellow Philaxis Society. In 2017 Philaxis Convention in St. Louis, he was awarded the Charles H. Wesley History Medal and enrolled in the Philaxis Society Harry A. Williamson Hall of Fame.
Now, on December 14th, 2016, the history of the Most Worshipful Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia, 1822 through 2016, was released by the David A. McWilliams Research and Educational Lodge, the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Washington, D.C., PHA.
Lastly, Tehuti Evans travels and lectures on a wide range of topics, including ancient African and African American history and American history, esoteric topics, and African American Freemasonry. Well, you gave us quite a bit to read there. You are a very accomplished and very talented writer. We thank you so much for coming. Fred, do you want to mention something about his recent?
Let me start off with a couple of things here. First of all, being named a fellow at the Philaxis Society is quite an honor, because there's only 15 fellows, right, Tehuti?
That is correct. I was both surprised and honored being named a fellow this year. But there, as you said, there are only 15 slots for fellows in the organization. And I'm very happy to have been moved into one of those.
Historically, why is it that there are only 15?
Well, when the society was found, its founder, Joseph Walks, really brought forth to the board that we would have as many fellows as were members of African Lodge number 1, which was formed in 1778. It was Prince Hall and 14 other brothers, or African American men, who were raised into Freemasonry. That is the foundation of African Americans in Freemasonry in the United States. So from the initial 15 men who were made Masons in 1778, the Philaxis Society has 15 fellows.
Excellent. What a nice tradition to.
Yeah. What I'd like to do is that, we want to discuss the article that you wrote on Hermes Trismegistus in the Lux e Tenebris that was just published. But before we discuss that article, I'd like to have you talk a little bit about an article previous to that, which you presented to the Philaxis Society on the origins of mathematics. Can you say some words on that, please?
Yes. 2 years ago, I presented a paper, The Origin of Mathematics. And in that paper, I presented 2 instances of 2 old documents. One goes back to at least 2400 BC, and the other one approximately 1800 BC in terms of the date that they were written. And in both documents, you can see very sophisticated mathematical formula, geometrical proportions and what have you, that shows that long before Pythagoras journeyed to Egypt about 500 BC, that the Egyptians were using advanced mathematics, and probably in the construction of the Great Pyramid, if the date of 2400 BC is correct. But that even though the documents don't pertain to the building of the pyramid structures, it does, it is written proof that in fact the people in the Nile Valley cultures were using advanced mathematics at least 1800 years before Pythagoras was born. Now, not to put down Pythagoras, but oftentimes in African history is portrayed, it is portrayed as if there was no educational development in Africa until after European contact. And if the first European contact is considered the Greeks, when Alexander and his forces came to Egypt approximately 332, again, we wanted to show that there's an older tradition in the Nile Valley being handy. What really is with some young men in the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia's Pythagoras order. Now, the Pythagoreans are the young men. That's the equivalent to, I think it's the D-Mole in mainstream Masonry. It's an organization for our young males. And when I was having a discussion with them, the question came up, well, if what I was saying is correct, why were they named after Pythagoras and not named after some ancient Egyptian? Of course, I did not have an answer to that question. The way I tried to answer it was that in general, we don't actually have a mathematician that we can pin the title, this person developed mathematics or geometry. We just know that by 2400 mathematical formula on them. So that's what inspired me to write the first article, developing proof for the young men that mathematics did in fact exist in Africa long before Pythagoras. What Pythagoras did, in fact, in the Greek stories about him, he traveled to Egypt and studied, and in fact, in some cases, I think it's estimated he was there 22 years before going back to Greece and setting up his school, where he did teach geometry and other mathematical formula.
So now we'll proceed into the current article that was just presented this year, Hermes Trismegistus in the Legends of Freemasonry. Elena, would you like to ask a few questions on that one?
Yes, well, you showed the book. We see who published it. Before we dive into the material, can you tell us a little bit about Lux et Tenebris itself? I know that's the title of the collection of articles from various authors. But is it a society within a society in a way?
In a way, that is correct. Within the Phylaxis Society, in fact, all members of the Phylaxis Society can submit articles for publication in the Phylaxis. And the Phylaxis Society has a board of editors that reviews all the articles and make recommendations as to whether to publish those articles or not. But the Lexi Tenebris Society is a special group of fellows and past fellows or active fellows in the Phylaxis Society who are asked to publish sophisticated articles or more articles of a higher level of sophistication than what actually is published in the Phylaxis magazine. So as we are called scholars. So as scholars, we search deep, for titles and do extensive research and try to present topics about information that will actually bring light to the Prince Hall Freemasons in particular, but in general to Masonry and to the general public as a whole.
Excellent.
My particular in this edition, Hermes Trismegistus in Freemasonry was inspired by an article actually I read online about Hermeticism in Freemasonry. And the odd thing about the article, it pointed out directly that Hermeticism in Freemasonry is based on the writings of Hermes Trismegistus. The problem I had with that title is that Hermes Trismegistus is a name given to an entity that existed before the Greeks came into Egypt in 332, or before the completion of the library at Alexandria. Now, Alexander, of course, was off to, after uniting the 5 city-states of Hellas into the country for the first time, finishing the work that his father had started. We have a country, Greece, and he leaves Greece to go about to conquer the rest of the world. While engaged in battle with the Persians, a delegation from Egypt made their way to the Levant where his forces were, and asked him to come help rescue them from the Persians who had conquered what we call Lower Egypt, or the area down by the Mediterranean basin. So, of course, Alexander brought a detachment and came into Egypt, and he, with the Egyptian forces, were able to rid Egypt of the Persians, and he left one of his men there to be, I'll say, acting satrap, I think is the term they used, and he went off to finish conquering the rest of the world. Of course, in his trek, never made it back to Egypt nor Greece. And when he did, his 5 top generals decided that the best course of action for them would be to divide the great empire up into 5 sections, each one of them taking a part. And of course, Ptolemy, son of Lagus, the Greek general, chose Egypt to be his part of the empire, and Ptolemy came back and became the first Greek king of Egypt, or the first Greek pharaoh of Egypt. Part of his legacy, of course, was building the great library of Alexandria. And in building the library, one of the orders, of course, that he sent out was he wanted books or papyruses from all over the country of Egypt, all brought and assembled in one central place, and it would be that library in Alexandria. In addition to that, those books, he also issued an edict that any ship coming into harbors that had books on them, they would be taken and copies made, and a certified correct copy of the book given back to the person on the ships, and they would keep the original and have a copy of that book in the Library of Alexandria. So by the time, by the time of his son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, the library in Alexandria itself was a world-class center, and a lot of students from all over the Greek world came to Alexandria to study. And that started what would really, I call, the golden age of the Greek civilization. You had such people as Archimedes, Euclid, and others who made, after studying the documents in the library, they made great advances in developing all types of, like the Archimedes screw, which is still used in various places today, bringing water from a lower level up to a higher level. Of course, the work that Euclid did in studying the documents and solidifying what is called solid geometry, to where his formulas are still used today. In fact, I think Euclid, Proposition 47 is still used even to some degree today in Freemasonry. But what was of my greatest interest was those people who started studying the ancient documents purported to be written by one ancient Tehuti. Now,
Tehuti,
yeah, well, that's what it turns out to be. There's a place in the city, it was called Kimenu. And of course, once the Greeks came in, they renamed all of the Egyptian cities. So Kimenu became known as Hermonopolis. But before they changed the name, one of the things that we of the Greeks responsibility for was pairing the gods of their system with the gods of the Nile Valley or of Egypt. So with Hermes being the god of one of the gods of Greece, responsible for knowledge and what have you, they teamed him with the god of knowledge of Egypt. And at that time, this was considered Tehuti. And in the city of Kimenu, one of the last African dynasties of Egypt built a temple dedicated to him, and in front of this temple there were two what we call black granite obelisks erected, and on those black granite obelisks is the story of who Tehuti is or who Tehuti was. So once the Greeks got there, in fact, what the inscription basically says is that not writing the Medu Neter is what the present world call hieroglyphics, but the Medu Neter writing and a number of other things were all attributed to being created by Tehuti Ow, which means great, 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 or Tehuti 3 times great. And so 3 times great translated into Greek as Trismegistus.
The three, like Hermes, 3
so
times
this
great.
is Hermes Trismegistus.
It's one
right.
of the
So Hermes Trismegistus is Tehuti Ow.
Well, you start your article.
There you go. And
you start your article with mentioning that Mackey names Hermes as one of the sources or influences of Freemasonry. How do we get to what you're relating of Hermes Tehuti in Egypt to Freemasonry?
Okay, well, again, you're right. In Mackey's Dictionary of Freemasonry, I don't know the exact page number today, but again, if you go to Hermes Trismegistus or the Hermes of Egypt, go to section H and look up the Hermes of Egypt. And there he explains what doctrines from the Hermes of Egypt is part of the line, the line of persons who helped develop the doctrines of Freemasonry. In fact, he goes back beyond the Hermes of Egypt to Noah. He mentions some other persons. I think Euclid. I think he got Euclid out of place in terms of his timeline, but he mentions this Hermes of Egypt. So not just Mackey, but also in Coyle's Encyclopedic Dictionary of Masonry, Coyle's also points out Hermes Trismegistus as one of the founders. So finding that both Mackey and Coyles make mention, and if you go to the internet sites and look up the history of English Freemasonry and the legends of English Freemasonry, they also make reference to by one name or the other as one of the persons who information that is used currently in Freemasonry. During the conquest of both the Greeks and the Romans, and the conversion of the ancient Egyptian writings into both Greek and in Latin, all right, a lot of this information survived. Now, with the creation of the great Mother Church of the Western world by Constantine in 325 AD, as the church increased in its power, it began to limit what members of the countries that it had great influence over could read or could read, or what was heretical, or what was allowed and what wasn't allowed. So
Right.
a lot of information to science, the church kind of set on. In fact, two great Europeans, Italian Copernicus and Galileo, both who were astronomers and both who drew the same conclusion, that the earth was not the center of the universe, that the sun did not go around the earth, but the earth and what have you, drew great criticism from the church. And both were silenced by the church for asserting what would be today we'll call the astronomical truth, that the earth in fact wasn't the center of the universe, but that was church doctrine. So because the church insisted that its view of the world and what its doctrines were was primary, and it had the greatest influence in Europe from 800 AD until approximately 1500, it was the church and the kings. They ruled Europe, and what information was real or wasn't real was decided by those two bodies. The kings of England, France, Germany, what have you, all of those small kingdoms, they had some power, but the church had the most power. So by the beginning of the Age of Enlightenment, and there are a lot of things that scholars attribute to the beginning of this Age of Enlightenment. Oddly enough, one of them were the Crusades, because of the information that the knights and soldiers of the different European kingdoms discovered as they went toward the Middle East or across North Africa. Also to the Medici family in Italy, because it was in the 1400s that one of the Medicis came into possession of the set of documents, what we call the Hermetic documents. And so in as early as about 1452, but don't hold me to the exact date, but during the 15th century, a lot of Europeans began to go to Italy and study these documents, and these documents began to lead to a different way of thinking in Europe. And Europeans began to come out from under the absolute mental control of the church and began to look at more scientific evidence on existence, knowledge, mathematics. I mean, it's the whole gamut of titles that caused the era to be known as the Age of Enlightenment. And by the time of English Masonry, before the Grand Lodge was formed, but by the time the two bodies, the Ancients and the Moderns, unified and formed the Grand Lodge in England, now a lot of this knowledge was still being studied secretly. It wasn't being studied out in the open as much, and in the craft. But what this knowledge does, it teaches universal truths using allegory as an example of how to learn. I often tell people one of my favorite universal laws is outlined in a story by the ancient children's storyteller or fabler Aesop. So Aesop tells a story in his The Race Between the Tortoise and the Hare that you'll also find in Ecclesiastes, I think it's 9:11. That is, the race does not always go to the swiftest. It's Ecclesiastes 9:11. And even though the hare is faster than the turtle, a turtle can beat a hare in a race. So the race does not always go to the swiftest. So you can get a biblical scripture which teaches this divine truth that even out in the universe, like the race does not always go to the swiftest. Or you can look at a child's or children's fable and get truth. Well, I find the same thing in Masonry, that a lot of the lessons that we use to make brothers better men are allegorical as opposed to direct statements. And that the brother, you know, like we go out, we read and we study and we draw the truth from these Masonic lectures.
Well,
there's one thing that I'd like to bring out, and perhaps I'm getting ahead of the whole story here, but I think that there's one question I would really like to ask. And Tehuti, tell us why Hermes Trismegistus is important to the Black Masonic community.
Well, I just think that when we find the true origin of the foundation of a lot of the allegories or the teachings that we use today, it is a good idea to know actually where they came from.
Absolutely.
As a Prince Hall Mason, and you know, growing up in a society, the relationship between Africans to the primary population in this country has been a tenuous one over the years. That in Prince Hall Freemasonry, there are, how can I put this? There's inspiration in knowing that out of Africa comes some of the truths which we use today to make ourselves better people. And those stories have not been told very much in the West before. Again,
they get confused. Sorry, they get confused with the Greek story that you were telling us, and how the other influences, you know, more Western influences have come in. But I think there's a lot of credit given to ancient Egypt within Freemasonry in general.
Well, ancient Egypt as a Greek entity as opposed to an African one. See, even the name. I mean, again, as we're sitting here talking, there was never a person walking around in the Nile Valley who called himself an Egyptian. That was not who they were. I think Josephus explains it better in his writings when he said the Greeks were the first ones to go out and rename everybody. You know, so today we know the ancient Kamites as Egyptians because of the Greeks, and then what I'll call an aspect of cultural superiority. Once the Europeans have named something, no matter what the indigenous people might have called a thing, history down to today only knows it by the name given it by Europeans. So the Nile Valley country of Kemet is only known as the country of Egypt today. And so if Hermes Trismegistus, which is a Greek name, implies a Greek person, and it implies Greek origin of the ideas attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. What I tried to show in my paper, these were African ideas, that this was an African entity, all right, that got renamed by the Greeks once they came in. So in trying to inspire more pride in African Americans becoming Masons, I want them to know that some of our doctrine comes directly from our ancient ancestors on the African continent. Everything is not European in Masonry. Masonry doesn't claim everything to be European in the craft, but I want to make it clear to a lot of Africans in Freemasonry that some of the substance of the craft comes directly out of African culture. That was the purpose of the article.
Yeah, I think it's a great purpose, because Hermeticists do attribute the teaching, the axioms and the teachings to Egypt, but as you say, they call it's Hermes, right? And they say Egypt, right. And so it makes Hermes, a difference. Right. It makes a difference what you're calling it, and that pride that comes from redirecting your focus to where this really came from. What about the Emerald Tablet? Can you tell us something about it?
Okay, the Emerald Tablets. Well, the Emerald Tablets are a set of documents that are alleged to have been written again by this ancient character Tehuti. And I say alleged because what's called the translations of them put them in the same category that someone said they found them and got a special, how can I say it? Were inspired by a special divinity or special divine type force to know exactly how to find and translate these documents. I think that I find the documents very interesting to read. I think there are a lot of, generally a lot of divine truths you'll find in the documents. I have not yet been able to determine that these are accurate translations of an ancient set of documents.
Okay.
I know during the middle to late 19th century, a lot of researchers or explorers said they found a lot of documents and gave them a lot of names. Because this is supposed to be a Latin, I'm not sure. I would like to see something written in what we call the hieroglyphics.
Right.
In order for me to say that these were actually written by an ancient Egyptian. So I can't give 100% certification that the documents have the origin that they say they have today. Because again, another part of the story is that this ancient Tehuti might have been an Atlantean, and he came from Atlantis with all of this knowledge. And so the books written as emerald tablets were brought with him from Atlantis. So there's a lot of information asserted that I haven't been able to prove or disprove.
So do you think that Hermeticism itself, the philosophy of Hermeticism, had a big influence on how the philosophy of Freemasonry developed as it was expressed in the rise in England?
When you take, for example, part of the Hermetic doctrine, that the whole universe is all right, that's one of the ancient doctrines. It comes out from the Kabbalion and other writings of ancient.
Yeah, can you repeat that? Because you got cut out there for a minute. The doctrine of what?
Okay. The doctrine that the whole universe is mental. It's called mentalism. That the whole universe is mental. That it's a mental process that causes a pear tree to grow pears and not apples. That it's a mental process that governs the rate at which uranium, the half-life of minerals and how they decay. These things just don't happen. So in the mineral world, in the plant world, in the animal world, and as the whole universe works, that it's a mental process. It's not just out there by itself. That's a significant concept that I can communicate mentally, and learn the mental level of communicating with other things in the universe. As an example, African people, now I know Native American people and other peoples around the world, looks at the earth as Mother Earth. All right, we have established a relationship of making the earth live and it being Mother Earth. So there's nothing natural in our cultures about going around polluting it, like what kind of debris of all levels in the water or polluting the air, because we find it's a sacred relationship that we have with the earth itself. But all cultures around on the globe, they don't think that way. All right, as such, they haven't reached that level, or they don't have that inner thought within them that the universe is a mental thing, that we're all part of it at the level of mentalism, as such. Or to think that everything vibrates. There's movement in everything in the universe, that nothing is still. There is no such thing as stillness. So,
I think we lost you for a minute there. You cut out.
Hermetic principles that I see green down on this. Can you hear?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah, you're back. You're back now, but we lost you for.
Okay. I think it must be something in the speed of the processor. But anyway, go ahead.
Sorry. You are exemplifying or explaining for us some Hermetic principles, and this is important for our viewers, I think, to hear, who are not very familiar with Hermeticism. The philosophy itself is comprised of a number of principles, axioms, of which you were illustrating a few for us, which are you can correct me if I don't put this correctly, but they are thought to be truths, principles of existence, basically, of observation and existence. And go on, Tehuti.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. And just imagine that these principles were being taught as far back as, I'll keep it simple, as 5,000 years ago. These are not new principles. But again, the question comes, how did they come about? How did anyone come to know these principles and such? Exactly. Therefore, I mean, it's every Friday I've made a bond with my grandnephew. We watch a program together. That's one of the things we do together. The program that he likes is called Ancient Aliens, where everything, like in his world, he's projecting we're brought here by aliens from someplace. All right, not that anyone here on Earth developed any of these things themselves. So after every time they broadcast a new program, like I said, he's down in Fort Washington. No, he's down in St. Mary's County, Maryland. I'm in Washington, D.C. So after the show, we immediately talk to each other about what the show was about. I'm trying to ensure that he is not miseducated by a TV show that speculates.
Right. Right.
But the question comes: Are we on the correct timeline? I mean, at one time there was an ancient flood. In other words, is it possible that human beings like ourselves existed in civilized cultures before the Great Flood, and that from approximately 5,000 BC up to today, we are the result of people who flood, but there were complete civilization where a lot of this knowledge already existed. What is almost asserted in Plato's story about Atlantis would tend to give some
credence,
feasibility, or credence, or feasibility to the fact that might be true. The fact that they have found sunken cities off the northwest coast of India now, and they have found sunken cities off the coast of Japan, seems to indicate it wasn't primitive man that was wiped out during the flood, but it was civilized man, a cultured man had reached the state of development of culture and civilization that might have gotten wiped out by a cataclysm that we talk about as the flood. So how old are we as humankind in terms of developing culture and civilization? The timeline offered by Western scholars have us on this shortened timeline as if we, like are descended from from somewhere around after 10,000 BC up to today, we have about a straight line of development civilization. But what might also be true is that long before we had this straight line that we're on today, that human beings just like us exist. Remember, the Earth is the universe is billions of years old. The planet Earth somewhere between 12 and 14 billion years old. So we've almost been concretized into one way of thinking, is that we're on a timeline and we're it. And humankind never reached where we've gotten today. Well, the question is, how did humankind get to the point where they could raise 2,500,000 stones of approximately the same size and build a structure that lasted 5,000 years?
Tehuti, this is probably a little late to tell you, but if you look at your camera and not your computer, we can see you better. Oh. Yeah, there we go. I should have said this ages ago. We can see you better.
Okay.
You're so energetic. We don't want to miss any of that.
I'll say, and not to put a damper on this wonderful conversation, but time is limited, and we need to move on to.
Okay, what's next?
But,
the book.
Okay.
The book.
The book. Okay.
The book, The History of the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge, District of Columbia, 1822 to 2016. And you wrote this with Alton Roundtree.
Yes. Yes. And in December of 2011, two Prince Hall Masons came to me at my bookstore. They were two young proteges of mine while they were at Howard University. Often we had a lot of interactions together. But they had become Prince Hall Masons, and they were both members of the David A. McWilliams Research and Education Lodge. And they came and told me they had a project, and project, Brother Alton Roundtree, about writing the history of Prince Hall Freemasonry in the District of Columbia. With my background as a historian, especially as an African-American historian, they thought my skills would be handy in helping to complete this book.
Oh, yes.
All right. So I met Brother Roundtree, and in May of 2010, I came down as a volunteer with him and worked from May through November in that capacity as a volunteer. And there were two things. One, I discovered that even though I understood the historical significance of some of the information, there were some things about some of the information that I really didn't know and understand. All right, not being a Mason, there were just secrets that were staring me in the face that I couldn't decipher. But oddly enough, in November of that year, the Grand Master came forward and made me an offer I couldn't refuse. He offered to bring me into Freemasonry. I had studied it enough, knew enough about it, and I decided after that length of time as a volunteer that I definitely wanted to become a Prince Hall Mason.
Well, what a story! Well, your how you joined story is phenomenal.
Yeah. Well, but the other thing is the Brother Roundtree and I made two trips from Washington, D.C. to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, driving both times. And I got a chance to really get to know very deep questions of him. And again, when we got to Iowa, getting into the libraries, met some good people out there also. The librarian of the Iowa Masonic Library is the #1 top person in Masonry in my book. I mean, he's a great man. Both the past Grand Secretary and the current Grand Secretary of Iowa were both very generous to us also. But anyway, from May of 2010 until July of 2016, it was 90% research.
Wow.
And research and writing, editing, back and forth. But finally, we were able to go to press in the fall, and the book was published and distributed as of December 14th, 2016. It's a lot of information, 562 pages of information.
And I've read it all. I've read the whole thing. And you've got you've got 84 Grand Masters in there. I'd just like to point out one. I'm thinking, and as I'm reading the book, and I'm thinking, well, which Grand Master had the most effect, or which Grand Master was really on top of things. And I look at Grand Master Cook, and he was a Grand Master for a long, long time, more so than a lot of the other Grand Masters. And say a few words about him, will you?
Okay. Grandmaster John F. Cook, Jr.
Yep.
Yeah, he was a great Grandmaster, and probably one of the most influential, I think he was the most influential Grandmaster of this jurisdiction of the 19th century.
I thought so.
Yes.
I'm reading the book, I got that impression.
Right. Okay, yes. The reason, I think there were two things that contributed to his length of Grandmaster. One, the Civil War. The Civil War, I think, we lost a couple of brothers in the Civil War that wasn't in what we would call today our Grand Line. And the times following the Civil War, with so many newly freed people being, coming into the society, that what the Grand Lodge needed during that time period was stability more than anything else. And I think he offered that stability during that time period. Plus, he was probably the most learned brother in the jurisdiction. He was also highly respected, one of the most highly respected Black men in Washington, D.C., bar none. He was named, as I said, the tax collector of the district right after the Civil War. He was elected to the city's, one of the first Black elected to this what was city council. So he had quite a place in Masonic and civic affairs in the District of Columbia. One of his mechanisms that he helped develop was getting the members of the getting Masons in our jurisdiction to join other civic organizations that they formed.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, well, yeah, as a civic organization out interacting with affairs of the city, as opposed to the Grand Lodge interacting on affairs of the city, gave them more influence. One of the civil statistical associations, I was quite the social, civil, and statistical associations that he helped form, but he wouldn't take the leadership of it. In fact, the brother who was the chief usher at the White House ended up being president of that association. But they had a lot of influence in the city. Another thing that he remembered his father. His father was one of the founders of a very important church in the city and one of the important schools in the city. And in 1833, his father was his father left town ahead of a mob that wanted to lynch him for having a school and Black person. So, but John F. Cook had a long career or a long influence in the city, even after leaving the East as Grand Master. So he's considered as one of Washington, D.C.'s greatest sons, Black or white. But he was my favorite Grand Master during the 19th century.
And I enjoyed also reading about Buffalo Soldier Brother Mark Matthews, who lived to the age of 111. And I understand, Tehuti, that Alton Roundtree got to personally interview him.
Yeah, okay, yeah, you broke up a little bit doing that. But yeah, Brother Matthews, yes, indeed. He's one of our brothers here. And you're correct. He lived a very long time. I understand that from the mid-60s, about 1965, really up until the 1980s, he was quite active in his lodge here in the District of Columbia. A lot of the men here knew him and really loved him. But he had quite a story to tell, joining the cavalry when he did. Right. Fighting when he did, and all the way up to, I think, up through World War. I'm trying to say World War II. Yeah, that he had quite a story, and just to live so long. In fact, at the time of his passing, he was the oldest male resident of the District of Columbia. And and the second oldest resident in the city. There was a young lady who was 3 years his senior.
Well, for our viewers, you can find in the book, you've seen the size of the book. Fred, can you show it again? You have detailed the records of every single Grand Master there. It's a thick book. We recommend that if you have an interest in Prince Hall history or Prince Hall history of the Grand Lodge in the District of Colombia, that you go get this book right now. And
That's
as
right.
is our custom here, we usually show a short video towards the end of our interviews. We are having so much fun. We don't want to end this interview, but the clock is ticking. So we are going to show a very quick Artifact of the Month video, which is a book in this case by Manly P. Hall. And Tehuti, if you can stay with us, we'll say goodbye at the other end of the video.
Okay. Can you hear?
Yes, we'll be able to hear you if you speak during the video. Welcome to the 5th installment of Phoenix Masonry Live's Masonic Artifact Series.
I am Frederick L. Milligan, Executive Director of Phoenix Masonry.
And I am Elena Llamas, Director of Public Relations for Phoenix Masonry. And today, we're very excited to show you an artifact/library book, which is a golden anniversary special limited edition of an encyclopedic outline of Masonic, Hermetic, Kabbalistic, and Rosicrucian philosophy by Manly P. Hall, otherwise known as the secret teaching of all ages. This limited special edition was hand-signed by Manly P. Hall himself. See that on the next to the signature, it says number 1565, which is the serial number of this copy.
The Secret Teachings of All Ages is 245 pages. This book measures 19 inches tall by 12.5 inches wide by 1 3/4 inches deep. Following the ownership dedication page is a 3-page alphabetical list of subscribers, all 550 of them. These are the people who purchased the book before it even went to press. Very impressive company. It includes the famous author, John Uri Lloyd, the British Museum, the New York Public Library, Library of Scottish Rite Bodies, Valley of Los Angeles, the Henry L. Palmer Lodge, number 301, the Rosicrucian Fellowship, Los Angeles Study Center, the Seattle Public Library, the Theosophical Societies, San Francisco and Seattle Lodges, Universities of Leipzig and Washington, the Vatican Library, the Women's Century Club, the Hollywood Co-Masonic Lodge number 523, and the illustrator of the book himself, Mr. J. Augustus Knapp, just to name a few. From the preface, through the gracious cooperation of Dr. John Henry Nash, the foremost designer of printing on the American continent, the book appears in a unique and appropriate form, embodying the finest elements of the printer's craft. The pre-publication sale of this book has been without precedent in book history. The subscription list for the first edition of 550 copies was entirely closed a year before the manuscript was placed in the printer's hands.
From manlyphall.org, Manly Palmer Hall was born in 1901 and died in 1990. He was a Canadian-born author and mystic. He is perhaps most famous for his work, The Secret Teaching of All Ages, an encyclopedic outline of Masonic, Hermetic, Kabbalistic, and Rosicrucian symbolical philosophy, which is widely regarded as his magnum opus, his most important work, and which he published at the age of 25 or 27 in 1928. He has been widely regarded as a leading scholar in the fields of religion, mythology, mysticism, and the occult. Carl Jung, when writing Psychology and Alchemy, borrowed material from Hall's private collection. In 1973, 47 years after writing The Secret Teachings of All Ages, Hall was recognized as a 33rd degree Mason, the highest honor
conferred by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite at a ceremony held in his organization PRS, despite never being initiated into the physical craft.
An edited excerpt from Occult America tells us the secret history of how mysticism shaped our nation by Mitch Horowitz. Manly Hall attended no university. His roots in rural Canada and the American West, little obvious exposure to higher learning. His family tried to steer him into the more practical career of selling fire insurance. And one of his forays into professional life was as a banking clerk. During his life, Hall refused to discuss more than the most cursory aspects of his background. His sole published biographical record is a thin volume called Growing Up with Grandmother, a tribute to the woman he called Mrs. Arthur Whitney Palmer. Her real name was Florence Palmer. The pamphlet-sized work is notable for what it reveals about Hall's reticence to broach virtually any intimacy of his childhood. Born at the close of the Victorian era, he was a man marked by a period in which the details of private life were closely held. Hall was born in the rural city of Peterborough, Ontario, to a father who was a dentist and a mother who was a chiropractor. A sickly child, Hall saw little formal schooling and spent long hours reading voraciously on his own. His contact with other children was limited, but there was a spark of some indefinable brilliance in the youth, which his grandmother nurtured on trips to museums in Chicago and New York. He traveled to California to be with his mother and came under the influence of a Rosicrucians community in Oceanside, California. He lived at the Rosicrucian Fellowship. He moved on his own to Los Angeles, where he fell in with metaphysical seekers and discussion groups. In 1920, Hall began a precocious career in public speaking, giving an address on reincarnation in a small room above a Santa Monica bank. Word spread of the boy's wonders, mastery of arcane and metaphysical subject matter. He began addressing an evangelical congregation called the Church of the People and quickly rose to the rank of minister. In 1923, the Los Angeles Times seemed positively smitten with a 22-year-old, covering his lectures and sermons in several articles. He is tall, the Times reported, with unusually broad shoulders, football shoulders, but he wears his curly, dark brown hair bobbed like a girl's. And even his face and eyes convey an almost feminine impression. Hall had begun attracting benefactors and traveling abroad in search of lost knowledge. Hall wrote across a spectrum of subjects, describing Egyptian rites, Arthurian myths, and the practices of alchemy, revealing the psychological underpinnings of arcane methods. Hall's collaboration with illustrator J. Augustus Knapp, whose watercolor plates run throughout the secret teachings, would last for the rest of Hall's career. Hall's world travels in the early 1920s gave him some degree of proximity to the monuments and philosophies of antiquity. But the materials that finally made it possible for him to complete his secret teachings were those he discovered in the great Western libraries, just opening to widespread public use. Hall toiled over books of myth and symbol and amassed a bibliography of nearly 1,000 entries. And byproduct of the general lack of interest in the topics he loved. While self-published and self-financed and invisible to mainstream scholars, the secret teachings soared on the wings of enthusiastic reports from readers. All received a letter from the Crown Prince of Sweden praising the work. Freemasonic lodges everywhere bought copies, and to this day, the book remains a standard in Masonic libraries. Its admirers ranged from General John J. Pershing, the ramrod straight commander of American forces in World War I, to a generation later, Elvis Presley, who possessed his own signed copy, just like Phoenix Masonry. The enthusiasts of the esoteric, the secret teachings solidified Hall's reputation as a scholar of mythic proportions. Hall is estimated to have delivered about 8,000 lectures, typically given without notes, recited with crystalline precision. And that's the end of the edited excerpt.
Mendick Hall wrote on theosophy as well as Freemason. He co-wrote H.P. Blavatsky and the Secret Doctrine, in which he discussed the famous theosophist and her secret doctrine. Hall wrote the book The Lost Keys of Freemasonry, which remains a favorite book among many Freemasons. We would like to invite our viewers to click on the link here, link below, to Phoenix Masonry's website, where you can see some photographs of illustrations in the book, and also Mendick Hall's signature and the table of content and chapters that you can click into.
Thank you for joining us for this 5th installment of Phoenix Masonry Live's Masonic Artifacts series.
Until next time, ciao.
And here we are back again with Tehuti Evans, and that was a kind of a long artifact, but
yes, thank you, Tehuti, for sitting with us through it.
And you know, we've just scratched the surface, Tehuti. I mean, there's so much more we could talk with you about that. We will think about inviting you back, and we're going to be interviewing Alton Roundtree. I don't know, perhaps you can come back with him, or we can have you back on another show another time, because we have so much information and questions that were not given today and things that were not answered today that I am sure that our viewers are going to want to see you again.
You are muted, Tehuti. In case you want to speak, your microphone is muted.
Hello?
Yes, now we can hear you. Oh, it shows muted, but we can hear you.
Okay.
That's strange.
Yeah, I was just keeping quiet. But look, thank you very much again for the invitation. I enjoyed the show. Of All Ages is one of my favorite books. So I was very happy to see that you featured it. And by the way, there's a one of the largest in size copies of the book is at the Masonic Library in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. If you ever get up there, Fred, I think you would enjoy it.
Yes. Yes, I would like that.
Excellent. Well, we had a great time. We do recommend to our viewers, you know, that you look up the materials we discussed here. Excellent history, a lot of reason that to have pride. You know, our historically in the story of Hermes or Tehuti. I have one last question for you, Tehuti. I cannot not ask this. What is it like to be called Tehuti? And how did you come to have that name? Was that your given name? Were your parents esoterists? I can't hear you. You're muted. Oh, no, you're not muted. You're just quiet.
No, I'm not muted. Okay, just, no, it's a long story, but I'll make it as short as possible. The name given at birth was Thomas. I was in a class, and the origin of the name Thomas goes back to one of the forms the translation of the name Tehuti, which is called Thoth or Thoth. Thothmos, Thothmosc, one born with the attributes of Thoth or Tehuti, is the form of that name. So as the anglicized version of Thothmos. So given the name Thomas at birth and tracing it backwards, again, the origin of the name is rests in the name Tehuti.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you for talking about Tehuti and Kemet, I will say, otherwise known as Egypt and Hermes. And
there you go.
Thank you so much. We had a great time.
Thank you, Tehuti.
Thank you very much. Look forward to seeing you again, Fred, and definitely following your show.
Thank you.
All right.
And that's all we have for you this time.
I'm Frederick L. Milliken.
And Elena Llamas.
Until next time.
Partying on the Square.